The water is cold enough to kill a man, and it is the middle of the night, and he is nowhere near a beach. He has spent months learning how to cross one, how to come down the ramp into the surf, up the sand, and stay alive while somebody tries to stop him. And now, he is out in the open English Channel, in the dark, with a fire spreading across the water and a ship going down behind him. There is no beach at all, just the black water and the cold coming up through him, and the slow, terrible understanding that this was supposed to be the practice. The beach he trained for is still 6 weeks away. He will not live to see it. This is the story of almost 1,000 American servicemen who died getting ready for D-Day. Not on it, getting ready for it. And of the silence that was wrapped around them so tightly and for so long that most of their own country never knew they were gone. They were not, most of them, hardened veterans. They were the men who were going to make up the follow-on waves at Utah, infantry from the Army's 7th Corps, engineers whose job was to blow the obstacles off the beach, sailors who ran the landing ships. A great many of them were very young. A great many of them had never been shot at, or shelled, or torpedoed, because for them the war had not actually started yet. It was 6 weeks away, and coming closer every day. By the spring of 1944, the invasion of Europe was the worst-kept secret in the world, and the most closely guarded one at the same time. Everybody knew it was coming. Almost nobody knew where or when. And the men who were actually going to carry it out had never in their lives done the thing they were about to be asked to do. You cannot throw tens of thousands of men against a defended coastline without rehearsing it first. So the Army went looking for a piece of England that looked like the place they were really going. They found it on the south coast of Devon, a long shingle beach called Slapton Sands. It had the gravel. It had a shallow lake sitting just behind it. It had the same slope running down to the sea. It looked enough like a stretch of Normandy the planners had started calling Utah Beach that a man standing on the one could close his eyes and stand on the other. There was only one problem with Slapton Sands. People lived there. So in the winter of 1943, the government told them to go. Around 3,000 people, some 750 families, were given about 6 weeks to pack up everything they owned and walk away from 30,000 acres of farm and village. A lot of them were old. Some of them had never once left the parish they were born in. They loaded up the livestock and the furniture, they took the valuables out of the churches, and they left. And nobody told them when they could come back, or really why they had to go in the first place. All they knew was that the Americans needed the ground. A whole quiet corner of England went dark and empty behind the fences. Most of them assumed they would be back by the summer. It would be closer to a year, and for some of them, what they came back to was not really a home anymore. What the Americans needed the ground for was to make the rehearsal as close to the real thing as they possibly could. The man in command of the whole invasion, General Eisenhower, had already watched green American troops come apart once, in North Africa, the first time they ran into a real enemy. He believed that men who had only ever trained with blank ammunition would freeze the first time live rounds came at them for real. So the exercises at Slapton were run with live, naval gunfire, real explosives, live ammunition fired in over the heads of the men wading ashore. Let them feel it here, in England, so it would not paralyze them there, in France. It was a cold piece of arithmetic, and every officer involved knew what it could cost. The question was never whether that carried a risk. The question was only, how large? That week, the answer came back far higher than anyone had bargained for. The biggest of these rehearsals had a code name, Exercise Tiger. The better part of a week at the end of April 1944, a full dress rehearsal for the Utah landings. Something like 30,000 men, A whole fleet of landing ships, live warships offshore, aircraft overhead, and the exact same timing they intended to use on the real morning. It was the invasion itself, run once, in miniature, against an empty English beach to find out what would break before the real coastline could break it. A great deal broke. I want to stop for one moment here, and I promise this is not the part where I ask you to hit a button. This channel exists for a single reason: to keep names like these out of the dark, which is exactly where these particular men were put. At the very end of this, I am going to ask you for one. If your family carried a name home out of that war, or the memory of one who did not, stay with me until then. What I am going to ask will make more sense once you have heard the rest. And inside that one exercise, two separate disasters were about to happen. People blur them together into a single event. They were not a single event, and it is worth the trouble to keep them apart, because the men who died in each of them have earned having it told straight. The first one happened on the morning of the 27th of April, on the beach itself. The plan called for a live naval bombardment to come down just ahead of the first wave, and then to lift and shift inland so the troops could land in behind it on ground that had just been hammered. But the timing came apart. The landings were pushed back, orders were changed at the last minute, and the change did not reach every ship and every man in time. And so, by the accounts that have survived, some of the troops walked ashore into a stretch of beach that was still under fire from their own side. How many men died in that confusion? Nobody has ever been able to say for sure. The numbers you will find run all the way from almost none to several hundred, and the honest answer is that the record simply does not settle it. What is not in any doubt is that American soldiers were killed on that beach by American guns during a rehearsal, and that this was the smaller of the two things that went wrong that week. The larger one came the very next morning, out on the water, and it started with a handful of small failures that on any ordinary night would have added up to nothing at all. A follow-up convoy of 8 landing ships, the big flat-bottomed LSTs, was moving through Lyme Bay to make a practice landing at first light. These were slow ships and heavy, loaded down with men and trucks and tanks. They were supposed to be protected, but one of their 2 escorts, a destroyer, had been damaged in a collision and pulled off the line, and through a breakdown in communication, the American ships were never told she was gone. That left a single small corvette guarding the whole convoy. And there was one more detail, one that sounds almost too small to matter and did not turn out to be small at all. The American ships and the British escort had been assigned different radio frequencies, and a mistake in the written orders meant that in the dark, in a crisis, they could barely talk to one another. On paper, the convoy had a proper escort. Out on the water that night, it very nearly had none at all. Out in the channel that same night, 9 German fast attack boats had slipped across from the French coast at Cherbourg. The Germans called them Schnellboote. The Allies called them E-boats. They were small, and they were extremely fast, and they hunted in the dark, and they had just found a line of slow, heavy ships that could not see them coming, and could not warn each other when they did. For the E-boat crews, it was the kind of night they had trained for, and almost never got. Most of the time they were the hunted ones, chased along the French coast by aircraft and faster ships. To come across a column of heavy, wallowing transports crawling along at the speed of the slowest vessel in the line and barely guarded at all was a gift they rarely saw. They took it, and they were gone again, back into the dark, before the convoy had even fully understood what was being done to it. What happened next took less than an hour. The E-boats came in among the landing ships and started firing torpedoes. One of them struck LST-531, and she rolled over and went down in a matter of minutes. Another hit LST-507 and set her burning. A third tore into LST-289, though somehow she stayed up and clawed her way back to port. Men who a moment earlier had been trying to sleep in their bunks were suddenly in the sea, in the dark, in a cold that could take a life all on its own. And here is where those small failures turned into dead men. A lot of the soldiers had been handed life belts, but nobody had ever shown them the right way to wear one. So they buckled them on around the waist, which seemed sensible, instead of up under the arms. And when a man in full combat gear went over the side with the belt around his middle, the belt did the exact opposite of what it was for. It flipped him over. It held him face down in the water and would not let him roll back. Men who knew perfectly well how to swim drowned like that, turned under by the one piece of equipment that was meant to keep them up. Others just gave out in the cold before anyone could reach them, because the ships that should have been hauling them out of the water were too few and too far off, and some of them did not even know yet that anything had gone wrong. When the sun finally came up over Lyme Bay, 749 American servicemen were gone, 551 soldiers, 198 sailors. Lost in a training exercise in safe home waters weeks before the war they were rehearsing for had ever laid a hand on them. That is the number confirmed lost at sea. Add to it the men killed on the beach the morning before, whose toll no one has ever been able to fully settle, and the count for the whole exercise is usually put at somewhere around 900. One careful reckoning, made long afterward, set it at 946. And what happened after the sinking was, in its own way, almost as hard as the sinking. The invasion was only weeks off, and the entire thing hung on the Germans not knowing when it would come or where it would fall. A disaster of this size, in the exact waters where the invasion fleet was gathering, was precisely the sort of thing that could tear the secret open. So the shutters came down. The survivors were ordered not to speak of it to anybody, ever. The dead were gathered up and buried quietly, away from attention. It was kept out of the newspapers, and for the men who had lived through it, that turned into a strange and lonely burden, to have watched their friends die in front of them and then be told, in so many words, that none of it had happened. And there was one fear running underneath all the others, sharper than the rest. Among the officers aboard those ships were 10 men who carried a special level of clearance. The code word for it was BIGOT, and it meant that these 10 men knew the real secrets of the coming invasion, the actual beaches, the actual date. If even one of them had been dragged out of that water alive by the enemy and made to talk, the whole invasion might have had to be thrown out and started over. Eisenhower would not rest until all 10 were accounted for. Search parties went over the water and combed the shore until every one of those 10 bodies had been found and identified. Only then, certain that the secret had gone to the bottom with them, could the planners breathe again. It is a grim thing to feel relief that a man has been confirmed dead. That was the kind of week it had been. The men who lived through it each carried it in their own way, but they all carried it. By the accounts they finally gave, many years later, when they were at last allowed to speak, the thing that stayed with them was not only the cold, or the fire on the water, or the friends they had not been able to reach. It was the order that came afterward, to say nothing, to go on as though the worst night of their lives had simply never taken place. Some of them kept that promise for 40 years. Now here is the part that is the easiest to miss, and it is the part that gives all of this its meaning. The men who died in Exercise Tiger did not die for nothing, even though not one thing they did that week was a battle. Everything that went wrong got studied hard in the few weeks that were left. The life belts were the first thing fixed. Before D-Day, the men were shown, properly this time, how to wear them, and how not to. The radios were the second. The frequencies were straightened out so that American ships and their escorts could actually hear each other. The rescue plans were rewritten, so that when men ended up in the water, there would be boats already standing by to pull them out. The escorts were made stronger. Every single one of those changes was paid for on one night in Lyme Bay, and the officers who planned the real landings were convinced that every one of them saved lives 6 weeks later, on the morning it finally came. There is a comparison that gets made about Exercise Tiger, and once you have heard it, you do not really shake it off. More Americans were killed rehearsing for Utah Beach than were killed actually taking Utah Beach on the 6th of June. The practice cost more than the performance did, and the men who came through the real landing owed some part of that survival to the men who had already fallen, unseen and unspoken of, in the same cold water at the tail end of April. And then, for a long time, that was simply the end of it. The war rolled on. The secret that had been kept for the sake of the invasion just stayed kept, out of habit, out of filing, out of the plain, ordinary way that a thing nobody talks about slowly turns into a thing nobody remembers. The real figures were quietly put out later, but they came out into a world that was completely swallowed up by the invasion itself, and next to nobody noticed them. Families were left holding sons who had died somewhere in England in the spring of 1944 in circumstances that no one would ever quite explain to them. It might have stayed buried like that for good if it had not been for a man named Ken Small. Ken Small ran a small guest house on the coast at Tor Cross, right beside Slapton Sands. And over the years, he kept finding things that had washed up onto his beach. Spent bullets, buttons off a uniform, bits of military equipment that had no business on an ordinary English shore. He started asking questions that nobody seemed to want to answer, and then he just kept asking them, and out in the bay, resting on the seabed under the water, he found a tank. An American Sherman, one of the swimming tanks that had gone down during the exercise, still sitting there where it had sunk. In the 1980s, paying for it largely out of his own pocket, he had that tank raised up off the bottom. He set it on the shore at Torcross, right above the beach, so that anyone walking past would have to stop and wonder what on earth it was doing there. It is still standing there today. For an enormous number of people, that rusting tank on the seafront was the very first they had ever heard that any of this happened at all. Ken Small spent the rest of his life making sure the men were named and not just counted. He tracked down survivors. He pushed the authorities on both sides of the ocean to admit plainly what had happened at Slapton and to honor the men it had happened to. He was not a soldier. He had not been there. He was simply a man who found something on a beach and decided it was not allowed to stay a secret. So here is the thing I would like to leave you holding. We are used to thinking of the dead of the Second World War as men who fell in the fighting, and most of them did. But a few of them fell before the fighting ever reached them. They died in the rehearsal. They died in home waters, in the dark, in a cold that had nothing at all to do with the enemy. And then their deaths were folded up and kept quiet for reasons that, at the time, were painfully real. The invasion had to go in. The secret had to hold. But the secret does not have to hold anymore. There is no operation left to protect. What keeps these men hidden now is nothing but momentum, the long habit of a story that was set aside once and never picked back up. And momentum is a thing a person can decide, on any given morning, to stop. So this is where I ask, if there was a man in your family who served in the long build-up to D-Day, who trained on those cold beaches in England, who crewed one of those landing ships, who put on the uniform in the spring of 1944 and did not come home the way the films would have it. Leave his name down below. Just his first name will do, and the branch or the ship, if you have it. I read every one of them that comes in, because these were men who were made to vanish once already, for reasons that ran out a long, long time ago. And every name set down here is one more of them the dark does not get to keep.